In the last episode, Kuroda Nagamasa went into the land of the Jurchens to test out his new Korean allies and the Jurchens' fighting abilities. Now we catch up with the young daimyo Kuroda Nagamasa. I'm Stefan, and this is Japan at War. A little bit before the taking of Pyongyang, Kuroda's task was to subdue the Hwanghae province. For the most part he had, except the walled town of Yonan. See, Kuroda had been anxious to get to Pyongyang so he could take part in the glory of its capture. So he bypassed the small town thinking that it would be easy to clear out later. He returned on October 3rd, 1592. The defenders of Yonan numbered around 800 and were under the command of Yi Chang-am, a former magistrate and someone that was well respected in the town. During this time, he had been seeing to the defenses of the town. He had also brought his brother and his family with him. This action actually raised the town's morale, as it showed them that this was really do or die for him, and so it should be that way for them as well. The Japanese began the siege at sunup with around 1,000 men, and a letter sent to the Korean commander urging him to surrender. Yi Chang-am responded by saying, "We will not. You fight with soldiers. We fight with righteousness." In response, the Japanese decided to build a siege tower. From here, they would be able to fire their matchlocks and release their arrows over the walls, which was only about 4.5 meters tall. This made the Koreans very nervous, as the roofs of most of the buildings were actually thatched and would easily catch fire. This actually backfired though, as the wind shifted during the battle and blew the smoke and fire back into the faces of the Japanese and actually caught the tower on fire. Kuroda's forces then decided to try and scale the walls directly by climbing it by hand. This also didn't work, as the men were showered by pots of boiling water and shot at by arrows. Kuroda stopped the attack that afternoon and had a man ride forward with a white flag to discuss possible terms of surrender. The response the Koreans had was to shoot the man in the chest with an arrow. And then a soldier rushed out to cut the head off the man. On the 4th, the remaining men attacked once again, this time using ladders. But this also didn't work, as the Koreans at this time started to use iron arrows to actually destroy the ladders and kill the men. Commander Yi Chang-am also decided at this time that engaging against the Japanese matchlock men, well, it wasn't really smart. He gave the command that arrows should only be fired at men trying to scale the walls, and the archers were to keep under cover until then. With the Korean soldiers really not giving the Japanese an opportunity to pick them off with their matchlocks, the men decided to build a platform on Namsan Mountain to fire down at the Yonan defenders. The Koreans responded by building a wall out of dirt and clay to block the bullets. After that failed, the Japanese decided to attack the west gate that night with burning arrows, and a strong wind extinguished the fire. Kuroda Nagamasa left at this time to get more soldiers, as, well, this wasn't working out well for him. It was now October the 5th, and Kuroda Nagamasa returned with the daimyo Otomo Yoshimune, which brought the total of men in the Japanese forces to around 6,000. Kuroda decided that the Korean defenders were much more tactically intelligent than any of the forces that he had faced so far. So he would need to simply overwhelm them in a massive push. The attack started by the matchlock men opening fire on the walls, but once again, the archers stayed under cover. While they were being fired upon, they gathered any piece of spare dry wood and threw it in piles over the walls and lit them on fire to prevent the Japanese from being able to use their ladders to scale the walls. And the smoke also made it incredibly hard for the Japanese to see, any of the Korean soldiers, and especially made it hard to fire at them. This stopped the Japanese for quite some time, but eventually the flames started to die down. And then they were able to get close enough to throw dirt on top of the wood piles to kill the flames. And then, they were back on the walls. The Koreans at this time were on the verge of collapsing. Commander Yi Chang-am actually climbed on top of a pile of dry wood and ordered his son to light it on fire if the Japanese made it over the wall, and shouted at the top of his lungs that he would rather be burned to death than taken alive by the enemy. His men and the town's women were actually pretty inspired by this and kept fighting with determination. The fighting lasted all the way into the morning on October 6th, and the Japanese pulled back into their camp. Kuroda Nagamasa and Otomo Yoshimune debated how best to continue, or even if they should. These talks lasted all the way into the night. This prolonged break in the attacks was exactly what the Koreans had been hoping for. Two men, Jeon Hyun-rong and Jo Sin-ok, snuck out with dry straw and used it to light the Japanese camps on fire. As the flames started to become, unmanageable, some of the Japanese men decided that the best thing to do would be to attack the walls of Yonan once again. The defenders threw small pieces of wood and straw that was on fire at the attackers. And this lasted until daybreak. And then Kuroda Nagamasa gave the orders to pull out of the area. The defenders of Yonan had outlasted the attackers. This defeat at first seems like a very small one. Kuroda and Otomo lost between 2,000 to 3,000 men in the assault, which, if you take the combined number of the Japanese invasion force, it isn't that much, but it was actually pretty important. See, Kuroda's third contingency had now changed how it operated. Before, its job was to take control of the Hwanghae province. Now, with the reduction in its manpower, now its job was to protect major supply routes from Hanyang to Pyongyang. It also meant that the Koreans had protected and secured transportation routes from Jeolla province to Uichu. Of course, this is where I will leave you. But before I go, I'd like to ask you a question. What do you think Kuroda Nagamasa could have done differently to achieve victory? I look forward to reading your comments and discussing it with you. If you haven't already, make sure that you're subscribed and give this video a thumbs up. See you next time.